Today, we have three speakers who will share their personal experiences. Our first speaker is Vicki Chen, who has been a member of the fellowship for 13 years. She served as president and on many committees. Vicky is retired from AIG and has two grown children. Our second speaker will be Alicia Gong McCreary, and she's a personal friend of mine from Jackson, Mississippi. Alicia was born and raised in Cleveland, Mississippi. She has two beautiful daughters, one a recent college grad and the other still in college. Alicia is married to Reverend Justin McCreary, the Jackson UU minister. Alicia works for AFLAC as the Mississippi Market Coordinator. Our final speaker will be Sue Needle. She was born in Korea and immigrated here in 1975. She's mostly lived in Houston, except for college years in Austin. She's been a member here since 2009, and she loves our fellowship. Thank you to all of our speakers. And now, Vickie Chen.
Good morning. Good morning. Let me start with my immigration story, which has two phases. First, from Asia to the United States, and then within the United States, from New York to Texas. I will also hone in on racism, as John Pepper suggested. By the way, John, thank you for hosting this. First, for political reasons, my family, my parents, left China back in 1949. That was when the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, won the internal civil war between the peasant masses and the landlord capitalists. It was a traumatic time period for our family. My grandfather, the head of the Naval Academy, was assassinated by the other side. Our family didn't have any choice but to leave China. So we fled by air from Shanghai to Hong Kong, thinking we would return. This was all that was told to me, of course. I was just a baby, much more concerned about my nursemaid's warm milk than the country's political upheaval. Later, after a few years in Hong Kong, it was apparent that the Communist Party was there to stay in China, and it was not just another invasion by the Japanese, French, and Germans in the past. My parents decided that they needed to immigrate to another country. At that same time, in the United States in 1954, it was just passed the Eisenhower Refugee Act, targeted limited immigration for skilled workers. Earlier, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act for some 70 years, and that was after the Chinese, called coolies, were recruited to build the Trans-Pacific Railroad. So with the new law, my mother, a medical doctor trained in Japan, applied, and our family was happily accepted. It was fortunate that she had open-minded parents that believed that girls should be educated as well. We moved to New York City, where a Catholic hospital sponsored Mom and furthered her training. She had to learn English. We all did, and she delivered many babies. We all learned to do housework as well. No more servants. Catholicism became a major positive force in our upbringing. Our family was most welcomed by the Catholic Church, and they helped us adjust to our new country. We went to Catholic schools and masses on Sunday. Really, looking back, I did not encounter racism growing up in New York, maybe because the city is multicultural and our friends and neighbors were from all over the world. Then I continued my college and graduate studies also in New York at Columbia University, which again is multicultural. I was not a straight A student, but I had to say that the university operated as a meritocracy. The second phase of my immigration was back in 1983, moving from the Northeast down to Texas due to my then husband's job transfer. I say this is also immigration because Texas was so culturally different. Houston then is not what it is now, therefore the nickname Cowtown. It was in November, the AC was blasting, and then I remember ordering chicken fried steak at Luther's and finding out that it isn't chicken. I have to admit though, I do like Tex-Mex. Looking back, I chuckle at some comments, a few of which I will share with you. From a welcoming neighbor who greeted me and told me that I speak very good English. Then with my daughter at her kindergarten class, when a white mother came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm so glad my daughter is in the same class as yours because Chinese have such well-behaved children and they're smart." And then at my son's graduation from Second Baptist, when the principal stood up, prayed, and thanked the Lord for allowing children of other races to graduate. These were all very well intended, I think. More serious is the racism that I experienced professionally. I remember being turned down from a dozen jobs, in many cases not even making the first pass. I think it must have been race or gender, probably both. I would not fit in with the good old boys. I was finally hired by a Northeast investment company with an office in Houston. Looking back, I had some good bosses who helped me along the way. Now, lastly, let me talk about the current Asian American situation today. Our group make up about 5% of the nation's populations, a little bit higher in Harris County. It is the fastest growing group. The group is upheld as the model invisible minority with well-behaved children, high test scores, strong family, and economic standing. Yes, Asian Americans have given America Yo-Yo Ma, I.M. Pei, David Ho, Seiji Ozawa, and Houston's own Yao Ming in sports where we're not considered to do particularly well. Just recently in a local newspaper, I read that of the 9 valedictorians at Bel Air High School, 7 are Asians, all very good. Unfortunately, underlying these successes are some serious hidden problems in our Asian community. Now retired, I have more time and I volunteer at the Chinese Community Center, a United Way social service agency. We had to deal with job training, homelessness, eviction, hunger, family abuse, physical and mental problems, and now physical racial violence in the community. COVID-19 has made these problems much worse. We have to overcome the racist unfair myth that the government does not need to help us because we do well ourselves. And our center has worked very hard to demand and apply for our share of grants. This week, I'm heartened by the fact that there was just passed, it was by the House and the Senate, the anti-Asian hate bill. So progress is being made. Ending immigration has been good for my parents, for me, and for my family. Racism, however, is hurtful and is counterproductive. It is a violation of several of UU's principles of justice in human relations and in the community. So I'm ending here, and I do thank you all for allowing me to share my story.
Good morning. Let me begin by telling you that this was not an easy talk to do. I'm usually the person who is behind the meetings and not usually the person on the meetings. So I guess the place to start would be with Travis on Station 19, a TV show. I'll let you in a secret of what kind of crap TV I've been watching since our kids left for college. The episode actually was addressing the tragedy of George Floyd. Apparently, the same day that Mr. Floyd died, according to the TV show, Travis's mom, who was Korean, got spit on at the grocery store by a maskless white woman who said, "If it's real, the Kung flu is your fault." So, blaming her for something she didn't even know was real or not. And at the time, the media was not heavily covering news stories about the violence that had begun against Asians. He said he watched the whole video and he felt absolute horror and fear, but then he thought, what do we even have to complain about as Asians? He, like me, thought that the Black community always had it a lot worse than we did. It's not something that generally I'd ever said out loud. And it was interesting that he said that, and I thought, well, that's what I think too. But I rewound it and watched it again and cried for a little while, and then, had a long think about it. I just don't remember having a hard time growing up. That doesn't mean that I wasn't called chink or Chinaman, or some kid didn't say ching chong to me as I walked by. It just wasn't something that I paid too much attention to. I was asked countless times if I could say something in Chinese, which I couldn't. And a lot of times when guys yelled at me and said that they loved Chinese girls and made kissy noises, I just rolled my eyes and walked on, but I almost never said anything back. And mostly that was because of being a girl, not because I was Chinese, but that's a whole nother conversation to have. But to add to that, I always got teased also for being too smart and told I must be great at math. And once a boss who announced that I was taking a job in his office said that I was really going to be good at my job because she's Chinese and you know what that means. And I have no idea what that means, but everyone laughed. They looked uncomfortable, but they laughed. In the Mississippi Delta, racism is everywhere, and it's been everywhere forever. In the deep South, in a tiny Delta town, being Asian it's different. It's not being Black, it's not being white, it's not being Mexican, it's just being somewhere in the mix of all that. And I grew up with white friends, with Black friends, with Mexican friends, and we all went to school with each other from the time we were in kindergarten all the way until the time that we graduated from high school, and some of us went to college together as well. So I didn't ever feel like it was a big thing to be Asian in Cleveland. The community, the Chinese community there in Cleveland and in the surrounding Delta towns was big. And that's something that is always surprising for people to hear. Usually they will say, we didn't realize there were even Chinese in the Delta. But the Chinese in the Delta sold groceries in the Black communities and even in the white communities. And they own the Chinese restaurants in town, doctors, lawyers, all over. They did all kinds of things. And my mom's family actually owned a grocery store in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which was about 40 minutes from Cleveland. And it was in the Black community there. My dad's family didn't own a store. My grandfather was in the Army, and when he returned from the Army, he came back to Cleveland to run the family farm. The rest of the family that the farm belonged to, they lived in New York and California, some in Houston, and various branches of the family came to visit during the summers to take a look around the farm, to wander around, ride three-wheelers, go fishing. And it was always a fun time to remember because I loved it when my cousins came to hang out for the summers. When my grandfather got throat cancer, my dad quit architecture school at Mississippi State and came home to help. I mean, one day he burned all his artwork that he had done at Mississippi State and in a big bonfire, and went on to do his work for the day. He was 19, so it was not really his plan, obviously, to quit college and come home and run the family farm. He took over running the farm, and then he went to art school at Delta State, which is the local college. And he stocked groceries at grocery stores at night or did odd jobs to pick up extra money. We were poor, but we were never in poverty. We all pitched in to help on the farm. There weren't very many. Actually, I don't think there were any other Chinese farmers around. But we all kind of did things, and I was the oldest, so I generally would help my dad. I've done things like run an auger in a grain bin. I've sat at the end of a field with a red umbrella to mark where the crop dusters needed to start, dusting the crops, and where they needed to stop dusting the crops. And I've also sat in the back of a truck running a flamethrower that my dad was driving the truck. I was in the back running the flamethrower to burn the fields before they did the new planting from the harvest before. So that was one thing that always scared the hell out of me. I always thought we were going to blow up and die. So, but when my brother was born, we moved from town to the farm across the street from my grandparents. I was about 9, my sister was 5, and we had been living in an apartment up until then. The farm was several miles out of town, so we weren't in town a lot after we moved to the farm. Sundays were kind of special days because we would go back into town and make the rounds of grocery stores in the Black community, visiting our cousins and our friends who owned grocery stores there. We had a lot of ice cream. We drank a lot of knee-high. We ate a lot of candy. And mostly I remember sitting on the store counter in my great aunt's store, helping her by counting Jack's cookies and penny candy into little tiny paper bags, or sticking my hand in the big pickle jar to get pickles for people who came in. And there was usually a big Sunday dinner cooking in the back of the store. And I have hurtful memories too, mostly good, but lots of hurtful ones. I remember people congratulating my daughter's dad for being so nice to adopt some Chinese babies when I wasn't with them and he was alone with them. I remember when Jess was small, our younger daughter being at a Pier 1 and a lady coming up to us and telling me that my English was so good. And after she walked off, me being speechless, Jessie turned to me and said, "Is she crazy?" I've had little old ladies tell Justin in the grocery store that I was pretty, and he would say something like, "Well, you could tell her she speaks English." The picture from our daughter's softball team started calling her chink and just did a whole bunch of old school bullying of her for a good year. We ended up sort of telling Jess at that time that she kind of needed to handle the bullying, because if we were to go up there to make a stink, not only would they shut down the softball team there, but there would probably be a lot of TV coverage for that too, just because it would be a racial issue in a public school. And then I do remember a family friend telling my sister when she was out to dinner with them that they thought of us as white. I think that, of course, she thought she was being sweet, and she was being sweet, but it was just kind of a confusing thing for us to hear as kids. We didn't quite understand why she would say something like that. And we have been deliberately and pointedly ignored in stores and restaurants, and we have lots of stories, all of us, that we can tell about those things. And some days when we're telling those stories, we laugh about them, and some days we cry about them. They're sad, they're very sad, and they do hurt our feelings, but it's kind of the way it was. My daughters have written several papers about them at school. We talk about them periodically. We talk about them with friends. People ask. But my most vivid memory of something that happened was something that happened to my mom. And I was probably 16 or 17. And she actually worked at the local college. She started as a transcript clerk there when my sister was young. And she worked her way up to being a registrar by the time she retired. But a group of teenagers had driven through campus on a bus. They were there to do a summer camp or something. And she said she was walking from our student union back to her office, and a boy on the bus rolled down the window of the bus and yelled, put his head out the window and yelled "chink" to her. And she said she stopped for a second, and then she went back to her office and she cried. And when she came home to tell me about it at the end, she said, after all these years, it still hurt my feelings. And you can never tell when it's going to do that, because most of the time it doesn't bother me, but today it did. And I cried with her. And some days I still cry when I think about that too. But I'm mostly just really mad at that stupid little boy for hurting my mama's feelings. Oddly, none of us speaks Chinese. I think my parents could understand it. My dad spoke a little, and I think I learned a little when I was young, but as I grew up, I kind of lost it by not practicing. We all have Southern draws though, so that's something that always confuses people. I spent 3 years living in Portland, Oregon, and I think every day that I was there for 3 years, someone always stopped me and said, "You're not from here, are you?" Plus, my last name was definitely not Chinese, so that was confusing as well. I like being a Chinese person from Mississippi. Most days, I'm not sure if I don't know if it bothers me more when bad things happen because I'm Chinese or because I'm from Mississippi. Mississippians and deep Southerners, they always kind of get the short end of the stick because people think all kinds of terrible things about Southerners, almost as terrible as the things that they think about Asian Americans. So progress here is slow. It's slow. And thank goodness our church and the sort of community that we have are trying to make a difference and change some of the things in Mississippi. I have to remind myself of that daily, sometimes more than once a day. But I still kind of feel guilty when I talk about my unpleasant experiences because, again, what do I even have to complain about? And to be fair, I feel like that when I talk about my experiences that I've had that are unpleasant that don't have anything to do with me being Chinese too. And it's something that I continually have to work on. I work on that with myself and I work on that with the counselor that I see because I should never have guilt about being upset about my unpleasant experiences. And as far as what's happening with the violence against Asians across the country, it's upsetting and it's scary. And it's scary, especially since we have 2 daughters out there and they're now old enough to be independent and they're going out into the world. Our younger daughter right now is in South Carolina. She drove by herself from here to visit a friend. She's been there for a week. And then our older daughter is in the process of planning a trip to drive from here to California in a couple of weeks. And I never want them to run into situations where they put themselves in danger. And I'm glad that the media is putting spotlights on that kind of thing. And I'm glad that the government is putting spotlights on that kind of thing. But I really kind of wish we were just getting attention for all those cool things that we do instead of us being beat up and stabbed. But I've enjoyed being with you today. I hope that some of those experiences are helpful, that you can never expect. You can never tell what people expect to hear from you when you talk about things that happen in your life. It's a little easier when they ask you pointed questions. But thank you for allowing me to be here today. I enjoyed it.
Hi, everyone. So like John Pepper said, I immigrated to America in 1975. A couple reasons for that. My dad had returned from America and he was just dazzled by America. And also I want to just share that, I was born with cleft palate and my parents were concerned how I would be perceived in Korea. And in Korea then, and even now, if you're handicapped or if you have a facial difference, you're automatically a second-class citizen. So one point I want to add is there's some pretty bad injustices in other countries as well. In terms of hardships, as an immigrant, I didn't have any extreme hardships, but I do want to share some interesting experiences I've had. So one night we heard a doorbell at our house. My dad was working. It was just my mom and us kids. My mom opened the door, and lo and behold, there was this big fire. Um, and my mom quickly put out the fire with several buckets of water, and she laughed it off because she didn't want to make us scared. And I'm so glad that we were at home. Otherwise, our house would have burned down. And you know, I think whether this prank was racially motivated or not, and I think it was. My second experience is when I lived in Oak Forest in Houston as an adult. My friend was visiting me, and she was like several streets away, and she asked a neighbor um, if if they knew of a short Asian woman, and they knew right off where I lived, and they directed my friend to where I lived. So in that situation, it worked out really well. Third experience, I have a teenage son who plays basketball all the time, and he plays with African American boys, and they call him Chink all the time, and which I think is kind of ironic, but I think what's happening there is, the majority, the African American boys tend to like band together and pick on the minority. So I think what happens a lot is that it's just hard to be a minority, whether you could be, a white guy living in Korea, and it's hard for him to be living in Korea, I'm sure. Lastly, I want to share some atrocities, some specific atrocities that have been happening in the US. In New York City, in February, a stranger shoved a Chinese woman into a newsstand box while she was waiting in line outside a bakery. In the same month, separate attacks within hours of each other. Two elderly Asian women were struck in the head on the subway. And then on the West Coast, an 83-year-old Filipino woman was randomly punched on a San Diego trolley. And a short time later, an elderly Asian man was pushed while walking in San Francisco, and his hip was broken in the assault. So from this, it seems like elderly Asians are being attacked. And so I have an 86-year-old father, so I've warned him, to be on the lookout even more so from being attacked. And I think that itself is kind of a sad thing that I've had to do. But overall, I think I've had it pretty good. I do see some underrepresentation of Asians in certain parts of society, like Hollywood and corporate America. I think because we look so strikingly different, we have not been able to assimilate at a social level. Um, and I think Asians definitely have a harder time reaching the top tier positions of companies. One Asian, though, that have defied this is our own Vicki Chen, who was a VP at AIG. So I wanted to make a point of mentioning that. So I just want to say that the spotlight on Asian Americans right now is kind of good and bad for me. I feel like, I need to be an upstanding citizen all the time. But I think what's most important for me is that we're coming together as a community to share our experiences and heal together. So I really thank the fellowship for allowing me to share my experiences today.